Welcome back to another descent into the darkest corners of American history, where we uncover the stories that time tried to bury. Today we journey to the rugged Ozark Mountains of Missouri in 1879, to a settlement called Branson that would become the epicenter of one of the most disturbing mysteries in frontier history. This is the story of the Holloway family, whose disappearance would spawn a legend so terrifying that travelers would avoid the Ozark trails for decades to come. What began as a simple case of a missing family would evolve into something far more sinister, involving ritualistic murders, ancient symbols carved into trees, and a pattern of disappearances that stretched across 3 states. Before we begin this haunting tale, remember to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss our weekly exploration of history's most chilling mysteries. Now let's step back in time to 1879, when the American frontier was still wild, untamed, and filled with secrets that would make your blood run cold. The year 1879 was a time of expansion and opportunity in America. The Civil War had ended 14 years prior, and pioneers were pushing westward in search of new lives and fresh starts. The Ozark Mountains of southern Missouri offered fertile land, abundant timber, and crystal-clear streams, perfect for farming and settlement. It was into this promising landscape that families like the Holloways ventured, seeking their piece of the American dream. Branson, Missouri, in 1879, was hardly the tourist destination it would become in the 20th century. It was a rough collection of log cabins, a general store, a blacksmith shop, and a small church that served the scattered farming families throughout the region. The population fluctuated between 50 and 70 souls, depending on the season, and whether new families had arrived or existing ones had moved on to greener pastures. The terrain around Branson was both beautiful and treacherous. Dense forests of oak, hickory, and pine covered rolling hills that could hide a man from view just 20 yards away. Limestone caves dotted the landscape, some explored, many not. The White River wound through the valley, providing water and transportation, but also creating isolated pockets where a person could disappear without a trace. It was into this wild and beautiful but dangerous landscape that Jeremiah Holloway brought his family in the spring of 1879. Jeremiah was a man of 42 years, tall and lean, with the weathered hands of someone who had worked the land his entire life. He had served briefly in the Union Army during the war, though he rarely spoke of those experiences. His wife, Martha, was 38, a gentlewoman with kind eyes who had borne him 4 children and buried 2 in infancy. The surviving Holloway children were Samuel, aged 16, a strong boy who had inherited his father's height and his mother's gentle nature; Rebecca, 14, a bright girl with auburn hair who could read and write better than most adults in the settlement; and little Thomas, just 8 years old, who had been sickly since birth but possessed a curious mind that asked endless questions about everything he encountered. The Holloways had come to Missouri from Ohio, where Jeremiah had farmed his father's land until a series of bad harvests and mounting debts forced him to sell. Like many families of that era, they had heard stories of cheap, fertile land in Missouri and decided to risk everything on a fresh start. They had purchased 40 acres of wooded land about 3 miles northeast of Branson, near a creek that locals called Whispering Brook for the soft sound it made as it flowed over the limestone rocks. Jeremiah immediately set about clearing land for crops and building a cabin for his family. The work was backbreaking, but he was helped by neighbors like Ezra Blackwood, a gruff but kindly man who had settled in the area 2 years earlier, and the Reverend Josiah Mills, who served the small church in Branson and often helped new families get established. By late summer of 1879, the Holloways had built a modest but sturdy log cabin, cleared 5 acres for farming, and planted a late crop of corn and beans. Martha had established a small garden near the house and was already planning for the following year's planting. The children had adapted well to frontier life, with Samuel helping his father with the heavy work, Rebecca assisting her mother with household tasks, and young Thomas exploring the woods around their property with the fearless curiosity of childhood. The family seemed to be thriving in their new home. They attended church regularly in Branson, where Martha's sweet soprano voice added beauty to the hymn singing, and Jeremiah's practical knowledge of farming made him a valued member of the small community. Rebecca had even begun helping Reverend Mills teach the younger children their letters, as the settlement had no formal school. But the Ozarks in 1879 were not without their dangers. The region had been a hotbed of guerrilla activity during the Civil War, with bands of irregulars from both sides conducting raids and settling old scores with violence. Though the war had been over for more than a decade, some of these men had never returned to peaceful pursuits. They lived in the deep woods, emerging occasionally to rob travelers or raid isolated homesteads. There were also stories, whispered around fires on cold nights, of older dangers in the Ozark Mountains. The Cherokee and Osage tribes had considered certain areas sacred, and some of the old-timers claimed that disturbing these places could bring terrible consequences. There were tales of strange lights seen dancing among the trees, of voices calling from empty woods, and of travelers who had entered certain valleys and never emerged. Most settlers dismissed these stories as superstition, the kind of folklore that grew up around any wild place. But a few of the older residents, men who had lived in the Ozarks since before the war, would shake their heads gravely when such tales were told and warn newcomers to be careful where they wandered. Among these old-timers was a man named Silas Crow, a weathered trapper who had lived in the mountains for more than 30 years. Crow rarely came to town, preferring the solitude of the wilderness, but when he did appear, people listened to his stories with a mixture of fascination and fear. He claimed to have seen things in the deep woods that defied explanation, figures moving through the trees at night, circles of stones that appeared overnight in clearings, and animals found dead in patterns that suggested human involvement. Crow had tried to warn the newer settlers about certain areas of the mountains that he considered dangerous, but most dismissed his warnings as the ramblings of an old man who had spent too much time alone in the wilderness. The Holloway family, like most newcomers, paid little attention to Crow's stories, focusing instead on the practical challenges of establishing their homestead. It was against this backdrop of natural beauty and lurking danger that the Holloway family began their new life. For the first few months, everything seemed to go well. Jeremiah's corn crop came in better than expected. Martha's garden produced enough vegetables to see them through the winter, and the children seemed happy and healthy in their new environment. The first sign that something was amiss came in early October, when Samuel Holloway failed to return home from a hunting trip. The boy had gone out before dawn to hunt deer in the woods north of their property, an area he had explored many times before. When he hadn't returned by sunset, Jeremiah began to worry. When he still hadn't appeared by the following morning, Jeremiah organized a search party. Ezra Blackwood, Reverend Mills, and several other men from the settlement joined the search. They found Samuel's rifle about a mile from the Holloway cabin, lying beside a game trail as if it had been dropped. But there was no sign of the boy himself, no blood, no signs of a struggle, nothing to indicate what had happened to him. The search continued for 3 days, with men combing every inch of the surrounding forest. They found deer tracks, bear sign, and the remains of old campfires, but no trace of Samuel Holloway. It was as if the 16-year-old boy had simply vanished into thin air. During the search, one of the volunteers, a young man named David Fletcher, reported finding something unusual about a quarter-mile from where Samuel's rifle had been discovered. Fletcher had been following what appeared to be a faint trail when he came upon a small clearing surrounded by ancient oak trees. In the center of the clearing was a circle of stones, each about the size of a man's head, arranged in a perfect circle about 10 feet in diameter. The stones appeared to have been placed there recently, as there was no moss or lichen growing on them, and the grass beneath them was still green, suggesting they had been moved within the past few days. More disturbing still were the symbols carved into the bark of the trees surrounding the clearing. The symbols were unlike anything the settlers had seen before, consisting of angular lines and curved shapes that seemed to form some kind of pattern or message. When Fletcher reported his discovery to the search party, Reverend Mills insisted on examining the site personally. The Reverend was deeply troubled by what he saw, declaring the symbols to be pagan markings that had no place in a Christian community. He ordered the stones to be scattered and attempted to scrape the symbols from the trees, but the carvings had been cut deep into the bark and could not be easily removed. Jeremiah was beside himself with grief and worry. Martha took to her bed, overcome with the fear that her eldest son was dead. Rebecca tried to comfort her mother while helping to care for little Thomas, who didn't fully understand what had happened but sensed the family's distress. The community rallied around the Holloways, bringing food and offering what comfort they could. Reverend Mills held special prayer services for Samuel's safe return, but as the days turned into weeks with no sign of the missing boy, hope began to fade. It was during this dark time that the first strange occurrence was reported. Ezra Blackwood, who lived closest to the Holloway property, claimed that he had seen lights moving through the forest at night. Not the steady glow of lanterns, but dancing, flickering lights that seemed to move with purpose through the trees. When he investigated the next morning, he found nothing but some unusual markings carved into the bark of several oak trees. These markings were similar to those found in the clearing where the stone circle had been discovered, but they appeared to be more recent. The cuts in the bark were fresh, with sap still oozing from the wounds, indicating they had been made within the past day or two. Blackwood also noticed that the markings seemed to form a trail of sorts, with symbols carved into trees at regular intervals leading deeper into the forest. Following this trail of symbols, Blackwood made a disturbing discovery. About half a mile from his cabin, he found the remains of several animals arranged in a circle in a small clearing. The animals appeared to be deer, rabbits, and squirrels that had been killed recently, their throats cut with a sharp blade. The blood from the animals had been collected in crude clay vessels that were placed at regular intervals around the circle. Blackwood immediately reported his findings to Sheriff William Hartley, who had ridden down from the county seat when word of Samuel's disappearance reached him. Sheriff Hartley was a veteran lawman who had dealt with everything from claim jumpers to horse thieves. But even he seemed puzzled by the bizarre nature of the evidence. The advice proved prescient, because within a week of the discovery of the symbols, another member of the community disappeared. This time it was Mary Catherine Brennan, a young woman of 19 who worked as a seamstress and helped care for the children of several families in the settlement. Mary Catherine had been walking from the Blackwood cabin to the general store in Branson when she vanished. Her disappearance was discovered when she failed to arrive at the store as expected. The storekeeper, concerned when she didn't appear, sent word to the Blackwood cabin only to learn that Mary Catherine had left there more than 2 hours earlier. The walk from the Blackwood place to the store should have taken no more than 30 minutes. Another search party was organized, this time led by Sheriff Hartley himself. The sheriff brought in tracking dogs from Springfield, and the search party included more than 20 men. They combed not only the route Mary Catherine should have taken, but also the surrounding forest for miles in every direction. Mary Catherine's path to the store was well traveled and clearly marked. There were no side trails where she might have gotten lost, no dangerous terrain where she might have fallen and been injured. Yet somewhere along that familiar route, she had simply vanished. On the second day of the search, they made a disturbing discovery. About half a mile off the main trail, in a small clearing surrounded by ancient oak trees, they found Mary Catherine's shawl hanging from a low branch. The shawl was torn and stained with what appeared to be blood, but there was no other sign of the missing woman. More troubling still were the symbols carved into the trees around the clearing. They were similar to the ones found near the Holloway property and at the site where Blackwood had discovered the dead animals, but these were larger and more elaborate. Some of the carvings appeared fresh, as if they had been made recently, while others looked older, weathered by months or perhaps years of exposure to the elements. Sheriff Hartley ordered his men to search the clearing thoroughly, looking for any clue that might explain what had happened to Mary Catherine. What they found chilled them to the bone. Buried beneath a thin layer of leaves and soil in the center of the clearing was a collection of human bones. The bones were old, bleached white by weather and time. There was no way to determine immediately how many individuals they represented or how long they had been buried there. But their presence in a clearing marked with strange symbols, combined with the disappearance of 2 members of the community, suggested something far more sinister than simple accidents or even ordinary crimes. Among the bones, the searchers found several personal items that appeared to have belonged to travelers or settlers who had passed through the area in previous years. There was a tarnished silver pocket watch, a woman's wedding ring, a child's wooden toy, and several buttons that had apparently come from clothing. These items suggested that the bones belonged to multiple individuals who had disappeared over an extended period of time. Sheriff Hartley immediately declared the clearing a crime scene and posted guards to prevent anyone from disturbing the evidence. He sent word to the state capitol, requesting assistance from more experienced investigators. But in 1879, Forensic science was in its infancy, and there was little that could be determined from old bones beyond the obvious fact that people had died in that place. The discovery of the bones sent shockwaves through the small community of Branson. Families began keeping their children close to home, and few people ventured out alone, especially after dark. The symbols carved into the trees became a source of intense speculation and fear. Some believed they were the work of a cult or secret society that had taken up residence in the Ozark wilderness. Others thought they might be connected to the old Indian legends about sacred places that should not be disturbed. Reverend Mills preached fiery sermons about the forces of evil that might be at work in their community, urging his congregation to remain faithful and vigilant. But even his strong faith seemed shaken by the inexplicable events that were unfolding around them. It was during this atmosphere of fear and uncertainty that more disturbing reports began to surface from other parts of the Ozark region. A traveling merchant named Cornelius Ashford reported that his wagon train had been followed for 3 days by figures that stayed just beyond the range of clear vision, moving through the trees parallel to the trail. When he and his men had attempted to investigate, they found only more of the mysterious symbols carved into trees, along with what appeared to be the remains of recent campfires. Ashford also reported finding the carcasses of several animals arranged in a circle in a clearing, with symbols carved into the ground around them. The animals appeared to have been killed deliberately, their throats cut with a sharp blade, and their blood had been collected in crude clay vessels that were left at the scene. Even more unsettling was the report from a family of German immigrants named the Webbers, who had been traveling through the Ozarks on their way to settle in Arkansas. They claimed that their camp had been visited during the night by figures wearing dark robes who had chanted in a language none of them could understand. When morning came, they found symbols carved into trees around their campsite and discovered that several of their horses had been killed in the same manner as the animals found by Ashford. The Webbers had abandoned their journey and returned to St. Louis, spreading word of their terrifying experience throughout the German immigrant community. Their story, combined with the reports from Branson and other settlements, began to create a picture of a widespread and organized threat operating throughout the Ozark Mountains. Another disturbing report came from a circuit preacher named Reverend Augustus Whitmore, who traveled throughout the Ozark region conducting services in settlements that had no permanent minister. Reverend Whitmore claimed that he had encountered evidence of devil worship in several locations throughout the mountains, including altars made of stone, symbols carved into trees, and the remains of what appeared to be ritualistic animal sacrifices. According to Reverend Whitmore, the symbols he had found were consistent across multiple locations, suggesting that they were the work of an organized group rather than isolated incidents. He also reported finding evidence that the group was actively recruiting new members, as he had discovered crude pamphlets written in a mixture of English and what appeared to be Latin, describing rituals and beliefs that he considered blasphemous. Most disturbing of all was Reverend Whitmore's claim that he had been approached by individuals who attempted to convert him to their beliefs. These individuals, whom he described as appearing to be ordinary settlers or travelers, had engaged him in theological discussions that gradually revealed their true nature. They spoke of ancient powers that could be harnessed through proper rituals, of the need to make sacrifices to appease these powers, and of a coming time when their beliefs would triumph over traditional Christianity. When Reverend Whitmore refused to join their group and threatened to expose their activities, he claimed that he was followed and harassed for several days before finally escaping to safety. He reported his experiences to church authorities in Springfield, but his claims were met with skepticism by some who questioned whether an elderly preacher might have misinterpreted what he had seen and heard. It was during this atmosphere of fear and uncertainty that the Holloway family made their fateful decision. Unable to bear the constant reminders of their missing son and fearful for the safety of their remaining children, Jeremiah and Martha decided to leave their homestead and return to Ohio. The decision was not made lightly. They had invested everything they owned in their Missouri property, and leaving would mean starting over once again with almost nothing. But the combination of Samuel's disappearance and the growing sense of menace in the community had become unbearable. Before making their final decision, Jeremiah sought the advice of Silas Crow, the old trapper who had warned about dangers in the mountains. Crow listened gravely to Jeremiah's account of recent events and nodded knowingly when told about the symbols and the strange occurrences. According to Crow, the symbols were indeed the work of a group that had been operating in the Ozark Mountains for many years. He claimed to have encountered evidence of their activities as early as the 1860s, but had been unable to convince anyone to take his warning seriously. The group, as Crow described them, was composed of individuals who had rejected traditional religion and society, choosing instead to live in the wilderness and practice what he called the old ways. Crow explained that the group believed in ancient powers that predated Christianity, powers that could be accessed through ritual sacrifice and the proper use of symbols. They viewed themselves as the inheritors of knowledge that had been suppressed by civilization, and they sought to restore what they considered to be the natural order of things. According to the old trapper, the group was highly organized and had members throughout the Ozark region and beyond. They communicated through the symbols carved into trees, which served as a form of written language that could convey complex information about territories, resources, and planned activities. The symbols also marked sacred sites where rituals were conducted and warned outsiders to stay away from areas claimed by the group. Crow warned Jeremiah that the group was particularly dangerous to families with children, as they believed that young people were the most suitable subjects for their rituals. He advised the Holloway family to leave the area immediately and to travel only during daylight hours, avoiding any areas where symbols had been found. Jeremiah announced their intention to leave at the church service on Sunday, November 16, 1879. He explained that they could no longer remain in a place where their son had vanished without a trace, and where other members of the community were disappearing under mysterious circumstances. Several families expressed understanding and even considered following the Holloways' example. The family spent the following week preparing for their departure. They sold what possessions they could and packed the rest into their wagon. Neighbors came to say goodbye and wish them well on their journey. Reverend Mills offered a special blessing for their safe travel, and even Sheriff Hartley, who was still investigating the disappearances, stopped by to wish them luck. But as the Holloways prepared to leave, strange events continued to unfold around them. On the night of November 20th, just 4 days before their planned departure, Jeremiah was awakened by sounds outside their cabin. Peering through a crack in the shutters, he saw figures moving through the trees around their property, carrying what appeared to be torches or lanterns. Jeremiah quietly woke Martha and told her to gather the children and hide in the root cellar beneath the cabin. He took his rifle and crept outside to investigate, but by the time he reached the edge of the clearing around their cabin, the figures had vanished. In the morning, he found fresh symbols carved into the oak tree that stood beside their well, symbols that were more elaborate and menacing than any they had seen before. The symbols appeared to be a warning or threat, as they included images that seemed to represent violence and death. Among the carvings was what appeared to be a family of 4 figures, with lines drawn across their throats, suggesting that the Holloways had been marked for sacrifice. The incident convinced Jeremiah that they needed to leave immediately, rather than waiting until their planned departure date. He spent the next day making final preparations, and on the morning of November 22nd, the family loaded their wagon and prepared to leave their homestead forever. But their departure was delayed by an unexpected visitor. Dr. Elias Thornton, a physician from Springfield who had been traveling through the region investigating reports of strange illnesses, arrived at the Holloway cabin just as they were preparing to leave. Dr. Thornton had heard about the disappearances and wanted to examine the symbols that had been found at various sites, believing they might provide clues about the identity of those responsible. Dr. Thornton was a man of science, skeptical of supernatural explanations, but deeply concerned about the pattern of disappearances he had been tracking. He had discovered that similar incidents had been reported throughout the Ozark region, and he suspected that they were dealing with a group of individuals who were using fear and superstition to cover their criminal activities. The doctor spent several hours examining the symbols carved into the trees around the Holloway property, making detailed sketches and notes. He also interviewed Jeremiah and Martha about their experiences, paying particular attention to the timeline of events and any unusual details they might have observed. Dr. Thornton's investigation revealed some disturbing patterns. The symbols appeared to follow a consistent design scheme, suggesting that they were created by the same group or by individuals following the same instructions. More significantly, the doctor had found evidence that the symbols were not random markings, but appeared to form a kind of map or communication system. By comparing the locations where symbols had been found with reports of disappearances and other strange incidents, Dr. Thornton had begun to identify what appeared to be a network of sites throughout the Ozark Mountains. The symbols seemed to mark territories or routes used by the group responsible for the disappearances, and they appeared to be updated regularly with new markings added as the group's activities expanded. Dr. Thornton also shared some disturbing information he had gathered during his travels. He had spoken with survivors of attacks by the mysterious group, individuals who had managed to escape before being killed or taken captive. These survivors described their attackers as being organized and well-equipped, with detailed knowledge of the local terrain and the movements of potential victims. According to these accounts, the group operated primarily at night, using the cover of darkness to approach their targets without being detected. They were skilled at moving silently through the forest and had developed techniques for capturing people without leaving obvious signs of a struggle. The survivors also reported that the group seemed to have some kind of leadership structure, with certain individuals giving orders to others. Most disturbing of all were the reports of what happened to those who were captured by the group. The survivors described being taken to hidden locations in the mountains, where they were held captive, while the group conducted what appeared to be ritualistic activities. These activities included chanting in an unknown language, the use of symbols and ceremonial objects, and the sacrifice of animals in elaborate ceremonies. Dr. Thornton shared his findings with the Holloway family and urged them to report anything unusual they might encounter during their journey to Ohio. He also gave Jeremiah a detailed map, showing the locations where symbols had been found, warning him to avoid these areas if possible. The doctor also provided the family with some practical advice for protecting themselves during their journey. He recommended that they travel only during daylight hours, stay on well-traveled roads whenever possible, and avoid camping in isolated areas. He also suggested that they carry weapons and be prepared to defend themselves if attacked. On the morning of November 24, 1879, the Holloway family finally loaded their wagon and prepared to leave their homestead forever. Jeremiah drove the wagon, with Martha beside him on the seat. Rebecca and young Thomas rode in the back among their possessions. They planned to travel to Springfield, where they could catch a train that would take them back to Ohio and whatever future awaited them there. The last person to see the Holloway family alive was Ezra Blackwood, who watched from his cabin as their wagon disappeared around a bend in the trail that led toward Branson and eventually to Springfield. He later told investigators that the family had seemed in good spirits despite their circumstances, and that little Thomas had waved to him as the wagon passed. But the Holloways never reached Branson. When they failed to arrive at the general store, where they had planned to purchase supplies for their journey, the storekeeper assumed they had changed their minds about leaving or had decided to take a different route. It wasn't until the following day, when Ezra Blackwood rode into town and asked if anyone had seen them, that people realized the family was missing. Sheriff Hartley organized yet another search party, this one larger and more systematic than any before. The trail from the Holloway homestead to Branson was well-defined and heavily traveled. There were only a few places where a wagon could leave the main route, and all of these were carefully searched. The searchers found the Holloway wagon about 2 miles from their homestead, pulled off the trail and hidden in a grove of pine trees. The wagon was intact and still loaded with the family's possessions, but there was no sign of Jeremiah, Martha, Rebecca, or Thomas. The horses were gone, their traces cut rather than unbuckled, suggesting that whoever had taken them had been in a hurry. Inside the wagon, investigators found signs of a struggle. Martha's sewing box had been overturned, scattering thread and needles across the wagon bed. A small trunk containing the family's clothes had been opened and its contents scattered. Most ominously, there were dark stains on the wooden floor of the wagon that appeared to be blood. But it was what the searchers found near the wagon that truly horrified them. Carved into the trunk of a massive oak tree that stood beside the grove were the same mysterious symbols that had been found at the other disappearance sites. These carvings were fresh, the sap still oozing from the cuts in the bark, indicating they had been made very recently. More disturbing still was the discovery of what appeared to be a makeshift altar, constructed from flat stones arranged in a circle around the base of the marked tree. The stones were stained with what looked like blood, and scattered among them were personal items that belonged to the Holloway family: Martha's silver locket, Rebecca's hair ribbon, and Thomas's wooden toy horse. The arrangement of these items suggested that some kind of ritual had been conducted at the site, possibly involving the sacrifice of the missing family members. The blood on the stones appeared to be fresh, indicating that whatever had happened to the Holloways had occurred very recently, possibly within hours of their disappearance. Sheriff Hartley immediately expanded the search to include the surrounding area, hoping to find some trace of the missing family members or their captors. But despite the efforts of more than 50 volunteers, no additional evidence was found. The Holloway family had simply vanished, leaving behind only the grim evidence of their fate. The search for the Holloway family continued for more than a week, with volunteers coming from settlements throughout the region to help. They searched every cave, every hollow, every possible hiding place within miles of where the wagon had been found. But like Samuel Holloway and Mary Catherine Brennan before them, the family had simply vanished without a trace. As news of the Holloway family's disappearance spread throughout the Ozark region, Dr. Thornton's investigation took on new urgency. The physician had been corresponding with colleagues in other parts of the country, and he had discovered that similar patterns of disappearances had been reported in remote areas throughout the American frontier. Dr. Thornton's research revealed that the phenomenon was not limited to the Ozark Mountains. Similar incidents had been reported in the Appalachian Mountains of Kentucky and Tennessee, in the wilderness areas of northern Michigan and Wisconsin, and even in parts of the Rocky Mountains in Colorado and Montana. In each case, the disappearances were associated with mysterious symbols carved into trees and reports of strange lights and sounds in the wilderness. The doctor began to suspect that they were dealing with a nationwide network of individuals or groups who were using the vast wilderness areas of the American frontier to conduct their activities without detection. The symbols appeared to be a form of communication system that allowed these groups to coordinate their activities across vast distances. Dr. Thornton's theory was given credence by reports from other investigators who had been tracking similar cases. A federal marshal named James Crawford, who had been investigating disappearances in Arkansas, reported finding evidence of a sophisticated organization that appeared to have members throughout the frontier regions of the United States. Marshal Crawford had discovered that the groups responsible for the disappearances were highly mobile, moving frequently between different areas and using the wilderness to avoid detection by law enforcement. They appeared to have detailed knowledge of the terrain and the local populations, allowing them to identify suitable victims and escape routes. Most disturbing of all was Crawford's discovery that the groups appeared to be motivated by religious or cult beliefs rather than simple criminal gain. Interviews with survivors of attacks and examination of sites where incidents had occurred suggested that the disappearances were part of ritualistic activities that the perpetrators believed would give them supernatural power. In December of 1879, a team of federal investigators arrived in Branson to take over the case. Led by Deputy Marshal James Crawford, the team brought with them resources and expertise that the local authorities lacked. They conducted a systematic search of the entire region, mapping every location where disappearances had occurred and documenting all of the strange symbols that had been found. What they discovered was a pattern that extended far beyond the immediate area around Branson. Similar disappearances had been reported throughout the Ozark Mountains, stretching across Missouri, Arkansas, and parts of Oklahoma. In each case, the victims had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only mysterious symbols carved into nearby trees. The federal investigation revealed that the symbols were indeed part of a complex communication system. Different combinations of marks appeared to convey different types of information. Warnings about law enforcement activity, directions to safe houses or meeting places, and even instructions for conducting rituals. Deputy Marshal Crawford began to suspect that they were dealing with an organized group, possibly a cult or secret society that was operating throughout the Ozark region. The symbols appeared to be some kind of marking system, possibly used to identify victims or to claim territory. But despite months of investigation, the federal authorities were unable to identify the group responsible or to locate any of the missing persons. The investigation took a dramatic turn in the spring of 1880, when a group of hunters discovered a hidden cave system about 10 miles northeast of Branson. The caves were well concealed, with their entrance hidden behind a curtain of vines and undergrowth. Inside, the hunters found evidence of recent human habitation, including the remains of cooking fires, crude sleeping areas, and stores of food and supplies. More significantly, they found a chamber deep within the cave system that appeared to have been used for some kind of ritualistic purposes. The walls were covered with the same symbols that had been found at the disappearance sites, but these were painted rather than carved, using what appeared to be a mixture of clay and blood. In the center of the chamber was a circular area marked with stones, and scattered around this circle were human bones and personal belongings that were later identified as having belonged to some of the missing persons. Among the items found in the cave were Samuel Holloway's hunting knife, Mary Catherine Brennan's silver locket, and a small wooden toy that had belonged to Thomas Holloway. The discovery of these items confirmed that the missing persons had been brought to this place, but it raised more questions than it answered about their ultimate fate. Deputy Marshal Crawford ordered a thorough search of the entire cave system, which revealed additional chambers that had been used for various purposes. Some appeared to be living quarters, others were used for storage, and one large chamber seemed to have been used for meetings or gatherings. The walls of this chamber were covered with more elaborate symbols, and what appeared to be a crude map of the Ozark region, with various locations marked with the same symbols found at the disappearance sites. But perhaps the most disturbing discovery was a chamber that appeared to have been used as a prison. The walls were covered with scratches and markings that seemed to have been made by fingernails, and there were iron shackles attached to the stone walls. The floor was covered with straw that was stained with what appeared to be blood, and scattered throughout the chamber were personal belongings that had belonged to various missing persons. The discovery of this chamber suggested that at least some of the victims had been held captive for extended periods before meeting their ultimate fate. The scratches on the walls included what appeared to be attempts to keep track of time, with some sequences of marks suggesting that individuals had been held for weeks or even months. Among the most disturbing evidence found in the prison chamber were crude drawings scratched into the walls by the captives. These drawings depicted scenes of violence and terror, including images of robed figures conducting ceremonies around bound victims. Some of the drawings showed symbols being carved into the flesh of captives, while others depicted what appeared to be human sacrifice rituals. The drawings also included what appeared to be attempts by the captives to record the identities of their captors. Several of the scratched images showed faces or distinctive clothing that might have belonged to members of the group responsible for the disappearances. These images would later prove valuable in identifying some of the individuals involved in the crimes. Despite the extensive evidence of human activity in the caves, there was no sign of the people who had used them. The cooking fires were cold, the sleeping areas were empty, and there were no fresh tracks or other signs of recent occupation. It was as if whoever had been using the caves had simply vanished, just like their victims. The discovery of the caves provided some answers, but also deepened the mystery. It was clear that an organized group had been operating in the Ozark region, using the caves as a base of operations for their activities. The symbols appeared to be part of a complex system of communication and territorial marking, but the identity of the group and the fate of their victims remained unknown. Deputy Marshal Crawford's investigation continued throughout 1880 and into 1881, but despite his best efforts, he was unable to solve the mystery of the Holloway family or the other disappearances. The case was eventually closed as unsolved, though it remained active in the sense that any new information would be investigated. However, Crawford did make one significant breakthrough during his investigation. Through careful analysis of the evidence found in the caves and interviews with survivors of encounters with the mysterious group, he was able to piece together a profile of the organization responsible for the disappearances. According to Crawford's findings, the group was composed of individuals who had rejected mainstream society and religion, choosing instead to live in the wilderness and practice what they believed to be ancient forms of worship. They were highly organized, with a clear leadership structure and established territories throughout the Ozark Mountains and beyond. The group believed that they were the inheritors of ancient knowledge that had been suppressed by civilization and Christianity. They practiced rituals that they claimed would give them power over the natural world and allow them to communicate with supernatural forces. These rituals often involved human sacrifice, which they justified as necessary offerings to the ancient powers they worshipped. The members of the group were skilled at living in the wilderness and had developed sophisticated techniques for avoiding detection by law enforcement. They moved frequently between different locations, using the vast cave systems of the Ozark Mountains as temporary bases of operations. They communicated through the symbol system carved into trees, which allowed them to coordinate their activities across large distances. The group targeted isolated families and individuals who were unlikely to be missed immediately, particularly newcomers to the region who had few connections to the local community. They studied their potential victims carefully, learning their routines and identifying the best opportunities for capture. They were particularly interested in children and young people, whom they believed were the most suitable subjects for their rituals. Crawford's investigation also revealed that the group had been active in the Ozark region for much longer than originally thought. Evidence suggested that they had been operating in the area since at least the 1860s, and possibly even earlier. The discovery of older symbols and burial sites indicated that dozens of people had fallen victim to the group over the years. The impact of the Holloway mystery on the community of Branson and the surrounding region was profound and lasting. Many families left the area, unwilling to remain in a place where people could disappear without a trace. Those who stayed lived in constant fear, rarely venturing out alone and always watching for signs of the mysterious symbols that had become associated with danger and death. The local economy suffered as well, as travelers began to avoid the Ozark trails, fearful of becoming the next victims of whatever force was responsible for the disappearances. The region, which had been growing and prospering before 1879, entered a period of decline that would last for decades. Churches throughout the region reported increased attendance as people sought comfort and protection in religion. Reverend Mills and other local ministers preached about the importance of remaining vigilant against evil and maintaining strong faith in the face of adversity. Some communities organized armed patrols to watch for signs of the mysterious group and protect their residents. But perhaps the most lasting impact of the Holloway mystery was the legend that grew up around it. As the years passed and the facts became blurred by time and retelling, the story of the disappearing families took on mythical proportions. The symbols carved into the trees became known as devil's marks, and the caves where evidence had been found were said to be cursed. Travelers through the Ozark Mountains began to report strange encounters that seemed to echo the events of 1879. Some claimed to see lights moving through the forest at night. Others reported hearing voices calling from empty woods. A few brave souls who investigated these phenomena claimed to have found fresh symbols carved into trees, suggesting that whatever had been responsible for the original disappearances might still be active. The legend of the Holloway mystery became a cautionary tale told around campfires and in frontier settlements throughout the region. Parents used it to warn their children about the dangers of wandering alone in the wilderness, and travelers shared the story as an explanation for the sense of unease that many felt when passing through certain parts of the Ozark Mountains. As the frontier period came to an end and the Ozark region became more settled and civilized, the Holloway mystery gradually faded from active memory, but it never disappeared entirely. Local historians and folklore enthusiasts kept the story alive, and occasional newspaper articles would revisit the case, usually around the anniversary of the family's disappearance. In the 1920s, a writer named Edgar Whitman published a book about the Holloway mystery, titled The Vanishing Trail, which brought the story to a wider audience and helped establish it as one of the classic unsolved mysteries of the American frontier. Whitman's book was based on extensive research, including interviews with some of the surviving witnesses to the events of 1879, and it remains one of the most authoritative accounts of the case. Whitman's investigation uncovered some additional details that had not been widely known before. He discovered that similar disappearances had been reported in the Ozark region as early as the 1860s, suggesting that whatever had happened to the Holloway family was part of a pattern that had been going on for much longer than originally thought. He also found evidence that the symbols associated with the disappearances were not unique to the Ozark Mountains. Similar markings had been reported in other remote areas of the American frontier, including parts of the Rocky Mountains, the Appalachians, and even some areas of the Great Plains. This suggested that the group responsible for the disappearances might have been part of a larger organization with a presence throughout the western United States. But perhaps Whitman's most intriguing discovery was a series of letters found in the archives of a church in Springfield, Missouri. The letters, written by a missionary named Father Miguel Santos, described his encounters with a secretive religious sect that he had encountered while working among the Indian tribes of the Southwest in the 1870s. According to Father Santos, this sect practiced a form of worship that involved human sacrifice and the use of symbols similar to those found at the Holloway disappearance sites. The sect believed that by sacrificing certain individuals, they could gain power over the natural world and communicate with supernatural forces. Father Santos described the sect as being composed primarily of white settlers who had adopted and corrupted certain Indian religious practices, creating a hybrid belief system that was both blasphemous and dangerous. The letters suggested that this sect had been active throughout the American frontier in the late 1800s, operating in remote areas where they could practice their rituals without interference from law enforcement. If Father Santos's account was accurate, it would explain many of the mysterious aspects of the Holloway case, including the organized nature of the disappearances and the ritualistic symbols found at the crime scenes. However, Whitman was unable to find any other evidence to corroborate Father Santos's claims, and the missionary himself had disappeared while traveling through the Ozark Mountains in 1881, adding another layer of mystery to an already complex case. The publication of Whitman's book sparked renewed interest in the Holloway mystery, and several amateur investigators attempted to solve the case using the new information he had uncovered. But despite their efforts, the fundamental questions remained unanswered. What had happened to the Holloway family and the other missing persons? Who was responsible for their disappearances? And were the perpetrators part of a larger organization that had operated throughout the American frontier? In the 1950s, the case attracted the attention of a young FBI agent named Robert Kellerman, who was researching historical cases involving organized crime and cult activity. Kellerman was intrigued by the patterns Whitman had identified and decided to conduct his own investigation using modern law enforcement techniques. Kellerman's investigation was more systematic and scientific than any previous effort. He used FBI resources to search for similar cases throughout the United States, and he applied modern criminal profiling techniques to analyze the behavior patterns of the perpetrators. His work revealed that the Holloway case was indeed part of a much larger pattern of disappearances that had occurred throughout the American frontier in the late 1800s. Kellerman identified more than 200 cases of unexplained disappearances that shared characteristics with the Holloway mystery: isolated locations, missing persons who vanished without a trace, and the presence of mysterious symbols at or near the disappearance sites. The cases were scattered across the western United States, but they showed clear patterns in terms of timing, location, and methodology. Based on his analysis, Kellerman concluded that the disappearances were the work of a highly organized group that had operated throughout the American frontier for several decades. The group appeared to have a sophisticated communication system, using the symbols as a way to mark territory and coordinate activities across vast distances. They targeted isolated families and individuals who were unlikely to be missed immediately, and they had developed effective methods for disposing of their victims without leaving evidence. Kellerman's most significant discovery was a pattern in the timing of the disappearances. The incidents seemed to cluster around certain dates that corresponded to astronomical events such as eclipses, solstices, and equinoxes. This suggested that the group's activities were tied to some kind of calendar or ritual cycle, supporting the theory that they were motivated by religious or cult beliefs rather than simple criminal gain. But even Kellerman's sophisticated investigation was unable to identify the specific individuals responsible for the disappearances, or to determine what had ultimately happened to the victims. The trail had simply grown too cold over the decades, and too much evidence had been lost or destroyed. Kellerman did make one disturbing discovery, however. His research revealed that similar disappearances had continued to occur in remote areas of the United States well into the 20th century, suggesting that the group responsible for the Holloway mystery might still be active in some form. This possibility was given credence by a series of incidents that occurred in the Ozark Mountains during the 1960s and 1970s. Several hikers and campers reported finding fresh symbols carved into trees in remote areas, and there were a few cases of people who disappeared while exploring the backcountry and were never found. Most unsettling was the case of the Peterson family, who vanished while camping in the Ozark National Forest in 1973. Like the Holloway family nearly a century earlier, the Petersons simply disappeared without a trace, leaving behind only their campsite and some mysterious symbols carved into nearby trees. Despite an extensive search involving hundreds of volunteers and modern search and rescue techniques, no trace of the family was ever found. The Peterson case sparked new interest in the Holloway mystery and led to speculation that the same group might still be operating in the Ozark Mountains. However, law enforcement officials were reluctant to make any definitive connections between the cases, citing the lack of concrete evidence and the long time span between the incidents. As we moved into the modern era, the Holloway mystery became the subject of numerous books, documentaries, and television programs. Each new treatment of the case brought fresh theories and interpretations, but none were able to definitively solve the mystery or explain what had happened to the missing families. Some researchers focused on the possibility that the disappearances were the work of a serial killer or group of killers who had operated throughout the frontier period. Others explored the theory that the incidents were connected to organized crime or to conflicts between different ethnic or religious groups. Still others suggested that the disappearances might have been the result of natural disasters or accidents that had been misinterpreted or exaggerated over time. But the theory that has gained the most support among serious researchers is the one first proposed by Edgar Whitman and later developed by Robert Kellerman, that the Holloway mystery was the work of a religious cult or secret society that practiced human sacrifice and operated throughout the American frontier in the late 1800s. This theory is supported by several pieces of evidence: the organized nature of the disappearances, the consistent use of symbols across multiple locations, the apparent ritual significance of the timing of the incidents, and the historical accounts of similar groups operating in other parts of the United States during the same period. If this theory is correct, it would mean that the Holloway family and the other victims were killed as part of religious rituals conducted by a group that believed human sacrifice could give them supernatural power. The symbols found at the disappearance sites would have been part of the ritual process, possibly used to mark sacred spaces or to communicate with supernatural forces. The group would have been highly organized and mobile, able to operate across vast distances and coordinate their activities without detection by law enforcement. They would have had detailed knowledge of the terrain and the local populations, allowing them to identify suitable victims and escape routes, and they would have been motivated by a fanatical belief system that justified their actions in their own minds. But even if this theory is correct, many questions remain unanswered. Who were the members of this group? How did they organize and communicate across such vast distances in an era before modern transportation and communication? What happened to them? Did they simply disband, or did they evolve into something else? And most importantly, what happened to their victims? The discovery of bones in the cave system near Branson suggested that at least some of the missing persons had been killed, but the remains of most of the victims, including the Holloway family, have never been found. Were they buried in other hidden locations throughout the Ozark Mountains? Were their bodies disposed of in ways that left no trace? Or is it possible that some of them survived and were held captive for extended periods? These questions have haunted investigators and researchers for more than a century, and they continue to fascinate those who study the case today. The Holloway mystery has become one of the classic unsolved cases of American history, a puzzle that seems to offer tantalizing clues but never quite yields its secrets. The legacy of the Holloway mystery extends far beyond the specific case itself. It has become a symbol of the dangers and uncertainties of the American frontier, a reminder that even in a land of opportunity and promise, there were dark forces at work that could destroy innocent lives without warning or explanation. The case has also highlighted the limitations of law enforcement and investigation techniques in the 19th century. Despite the best efforts of local sheriffs, federal marshals, and later investigators using modern techniques, the mystery has never been solved. This has led to ongoing discussions about how such cases might be handled differently today and whether modern technology and investigative methods might be able to shed new light on old mysteries. Perhaps most significantly, the Holloway mystery has become part of the folklore and cultural identity of the Ozark Mountains. The story is still told by local residents and tour guides, and the symbols associated with the case have become part of the region's iconography. The mystery has inspired countless works of fiction, from novels and short stories to movies and television shows, each offering its own interpretation of what might have happened to the missing families. For the descendants of those who lived through the events of 1879, the Holloway mystery remains a very real and personal tragedy. Some families in the region can trace their ancestry back to the original settlers who witnessed the disappearances, and for them, the case is not just a historical curiosity but a part of their family history. There are still people in the Ozark Mountains who claim to have had encounters with the supernatural forces that they believe were responsible for the Holloway disappearances. Some report seeing strange lights in the forest at night. Others claim to have found fresh symbols carved into trees in remote areas. While most of these reports can probably be explained by natural phenomena or human activity, they serve to keep the legend alive and to remind people that the mystery has never been fully resolved. The question of whether the group responsible for the Holloway mystery is still active in some form remains open. While there have been no disappearances in recent decades that clearly match the pattern of the 19th century cases, there have been enough unusual incidents to keep the possibility alive in the minds of some researchers and local residents. The development of the Ozark Mountains as a tourist destination has brought new attention to the Holloway mystery, but it has also made it less likely that such incidents could occur undetected today. The region is now much more populated and heavily traveled than it was in 1879, and modern communication and transportation systems would make it much more difficult for people to disappear without a trace. But the vast wilderness areas of the Ozark Mountains still contain thousands of square miles of remote and largely uninhabited terrain. There are still places where a person could disappear without being found, and there are still caves and hidden valleys that have never been thoroughly explored. For those who believe that the group responsible for the Holloway mystery might still exist, these wild places represent potential hiding spots where ancient practices might continue in secret. The Holloway mystery has also had a lasting impact on how we think about unsolved cases and cold cases in general. It was one of the first cases to demonstrate how disappearances that seemed unrelated could actually be part of a larger pattern, and how crimes committed in remote areas could go undetected for long periods of time. The case has influenced modern investigative techniques, particularly in the areas of geographic profiling and pattern analysis. Law enforcement agencies now routinely look for connections between seemingly unrelated cases, and they use computer databases to identify patterns that might not be apparent to individual investigators. The Holloway mystery has also contributed to our understanding of how cults and secret societies operate, particularly in remote or frontier areas. The case has been studied by experts in religious extremism and cult behavior, who have used it to develop profiles of how such groups recruit members, organize their activities, and avoid detection by authorities. But perhaps the most important legacy of the Holloway mystery is the reminder it provides about the fragility of human life and the importance of community vigilance in protecting the vulnerable. The case shows how quickly ordinary people can become victims of extraordinary evil, and how important it is for communities to look out for one another and to take seriously any signs that something might be wrong. The families who disappeared in the Ozark Mountains in 1879 were not wealthy or powerful people. They were ordinary frontier families trying to build new lives in a challenging environment. They had no special protection beyond what their community could provide, and when that protection failed, they became victims of forces that they could not understand or resist. As we conclude this exploration of the Holloway mystery, we are left with more questions than answers. What happened to Jeremiah, Martha, Rebecca, and Thomas Holloway on that November day in 1879? Who was responsible for their disappearance and the disappearances of so many others? What was the meaning of the mysterious symbols that marked the sites where people vanished? And is it possible that the group responsible for these crimes is still active in some form today? These questions may never be fully answered, but they continue to fascinate and disturb us more than a century after the events. They concern. The Holloway mystery stands as one of the great unsolved cases of American history, a puzzle that has defied the best efforts of investigators and researchers for generations. The story of the Holloway family serves as a reminder that evil can take many forms and can strike in the most unexpected places. It reminds us that the price of safety and security is eternal vigilance, and that we all have a responsibility to protect those who cannot protect themselves. In the remote valleys and hidden caves of the Ozark Mountains, the symbols carved into ancient oak trees still mark the places where families vanished without a trace. The wind still whispers through the branches, carrying echoes of voices that called for help but were never heard. And somewhere in the darkness of those deep woods, the truth about the Holloway mystery waits to be discovered. Until that day comes, we can only remember their names, honor their memory, and continue to search for the answers that have eluded us for more than a century. The Holloway mystery may never be solved, but it will never be forgotten. And the questions it raises about human nature and the darkness that can hide in the most beautiful places will continue to haunt us for generations to come. Remember to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss our weekly exploration of history's darkest mysteries. If you have information about missing persons cases, historical or current, please contact your local law enforcement agencies. Sometimes, even after more than a century, new information can shed light on old mysteries and bring closure to families who have waited far too long for answers. Until next time, stay vigilant, stay curious, and never forget that the truth, no matter how deeply buried in the shadows of time, has a way of eventually coming to light.